Hello friends and welcome to another episode of Ontario Permaculture. I'm Misty Murfarians. In this video, I want to show you one of the cob bread ovens that we were asked to create this autumn. We've already done one video earlier in which we showed you the basics of how you might go about a bread oven, the sort of broad strokes. In this video, I want to talk more about the little nuances and the levels up that we personally have tried and what we did differently between this stove and the one we did previously. So let's go have a look.
The first step of our process was to come and survey the land where they would work and see if we could find some clay that was suitable. Our first instinct was to look under this tree that had fallen over because that was showing water up in a lens, and though we tried several samples, that did turn out to be the one that we used. We proceeded to stomp some cob in the usual way, picking out stones and stomping it until smooth, then mixing in sand and straw as was necessary for the ratio. We then moved on to building a base that was the correct size for holding up the baking stones that were available for this project. We like to use what's available, and the homeowners at this site had quite a few cinder blocks that were there. They wanted a stone facing for the eventual oven, but the cinder blocks allowed us to build up the base really fast and strong without having to wait for much cob to dry, since we could dry stack them with relative stability. Since cinder blocks are so smooth, they don't give as much purchase for the cob to grip onto. To combat this, we put some small sticks protruding from the cracks, which would give a little bit of an anchor. As well, we painted the cinder blocks with a cob paste, just a thin down cob preparation, and that's something I've tried before and find really does help cob bond onto smooth surfaces better.
Yeah. Yeah, you can definitely step on that pretty good right now.
And especially like this is nice and dried out, so it's already got some structure, but when you take it out of there by the shovel pole, you put it on the tarp, it's just a puddle.
Yeah.
And people are astounded, like you can go from that puddle to nice and stiff within that little bed. It's like, wow, that's lovely.
We advised brick surrounds for the opening because the cob takes a lot of denting at the edge of the oven, and bricks have a little bit more wear on them, but being square and smooth, they have a tendency when knocked to just fall straight out. This is why we additionally advise that at least the central portion of the arch should be of a wider piece like a keystone so that the arch can hold together better.
To use a brick for the middle one, you'll need a rock or something that's bigger than a brick so that it's wider than a brick at the top.
If you want to be completely sure none of your arch will fall, you can make sure to get bricks that are larger than what you need and dress them all into wedge shapes, but most important are the ones at the very top. Next, we proceeded to square out the top of the oven. That's not normally what we would do. Usually it's a rounder shape, but this one they had very large and thick bricks that would be great for the oven floor, and so we sculpted out the cob so that it would accommodate those large bricks. The extra little space that you see in the top was to put in the insulative material. Instead of sand and wine bottles in this case, the homeowners had some vermiculite already, and vermiculite is a non-flammable and insulative, so we decided to give it a go as the filler material under the baking stone.
Not too much, because we want to put the bottles on top.
Is that actually mountain rock?
This is vermiculite. It's a
Lava rock.
yeah.
No, this is
Spread it with steam like popcorn.
so it makes it poofy.
Why is it smoking?
It's the
That's
dust.
Once again, the purpose of this layer is to prevent the heat that you have developed from burning within the chamber from traveling into the base and dissipating. You want all the heat to stay up in the oven chamber, and that's why we put the thermal break of the bottles, because the open air in them prevents the heat from traveling as quickly as if it was continuous mass. And in this case, the vermiculite is a little bit insulating, also stopping the heat from going in. So we've made a bit of a sandwich here, vermiculite on the bottom, then bottles, these are beer bottles, and then vermiculite on top to fill the area and also to give cushion so that baking stones can be laid on top without crushing the bottles. This is a phase at which it is really useful to try and get the structure mostly level so that when you put on your hearthstones or baking stones, they will sit relatively level, and that way you will have an easier time moving ashes and moisture or anything like that in and out of the oven. Level baking stones will also help the things that you bake to be level so that when it rises evenly, and it will also help the structure above to remain centered. Perfect level is not necessary, but fairly level is a really good idea. Here we have the door form supporting the brick arch. This will not be the eventual door, but is actually 2 layers of plywood that are separated by some dimensional lumber to be the correct width to hold up the bricks. Here he's cutting the keystone, a extra wide wedge-shaped brick that will help hold the arch of bricks together and keep it from slipping down when knocked. We use a relatively smooth cob as mortar here because straw sticking in and out can really prevent you from getting a good seal on the bricks, and you don't want it sticking out of the surface. We cob in the entire arch, making sure it is supported on the front because the weight of the dome that's going to go behind it has a tendency to want to push outward on the arch, which is not something that will make moving the door in and out very easy. So here we've got the arch, we've got the surround where the oven's going to be, and we're now adding some moistened sand to make sort of a sand castle in the shape of the oven that we want. We're packing it down just like you would do a sand castle and making it nice and smooth on the outside so that when we put the cob on, it is supported from underneath as it dries, nice and smooth and even, gives you a nice smooth and even heat distribution when the oven is working, but it also means that the cob itself can be relatively smooth and therefore not catch any dents or anything like that would cause the inside of the oven to get damaged and fall in on your baking. The general proportion that you want to follow is that the door of the oven should be about 60% of the height of the overall oven, which means you should dome the oven above where the door arch that you've just made is, so that the smoke goes up into the chimney and does not pour out the front of the door. This also helps hold the heat in better and therefore radiate better onto your baked goods. Then, using a smooth, relatively fiberless cob, we are packing it around the outside, making very sure to tie the pieces together as well as we can and not to make any bumps out on the interior surface. So we're smoothing out the interior surface quite a bit. We want to avoid smoothing it with too much water because that will cause it to stick and also to dry unevenly, but we're going to give it a nice smooth off with the hands so that the inside of the oven is as smooth as it's going to be, because you cannot reach through the sand to fix it, and once it is made, it is much more difficult to plaster the inside. At this point, we're poking very small holes into the cob to allow the moisture from the inside to also evaporate so that there's less cracking on the outside, which is caused by the water trying to escape once the outside is relatively dried off. I'm holding the twig at the depth that I want it to go so that the holes don't go all the way in to where the sand is, but only about 60% of the depth of the layer we just laid. Once that first layer is relatively set up, after a few days, depending on the weather, a second finishing coat is applied, which has lots of long fiber in it, giving sort of a vault for the inner layer to adhere to. We're going to make sure that that layer is also extremely well tied together, and we'll smooth it off relatively well. Once that's done, the fun part begins, and you can lay some sculpture on the outside. You should take into account what the weather is like and put your sculpture in a place where it's relatively sheltered. Now, that being said, the entire oven should be sheltered from weather, not just directly above, but any prevailing winds that could blow rain or snow onto it. But you can refresh the sculpture now and again, just as you can do on the finish. Just bear in mind that all of the details that stick up are going to cause water to pool there somewhat, and make sure, therefore, that any sculpture that you make that sticks out is on a relatively protected spot. The next thing to do is to remove the form once the arch seems to have set up fairly well. Now, a very important point is to put shims in on the arch so that there is a little bit of a space. You can see there's even a little bit of a crack that comes off. That is the most natural spot for stress to happen, but this is relatively minor and can be repaired after it comes out. For the form, we found that glossy on both sides, cardboard makes a relatively smooth surface to pull the form out from, and in this case we just used the lid of the beer box that the bottles that were used in the base had with it. After helping with a few different of these ovens, we do find that making sure the very top of the arch does not have a point makes it a little bit easier to take out, because that's the part that most often gets stuck, as that's where the majority of the weight of this structure is going to be pressing down on. When the sand comes out is dependent upon your schedule, as well as the weather and how quickly the layers dry out. Generally, you should not take out the sand until the upper portion seems good and set up. It does not need to be 100% dry, but it should be well set. At this phase, you can take an inventory on how the inside of the oven has performed, and if there are any major cracks or gaps, this would be the time to go in and fix it with another smooth, relatively small fibered form of cob or plaster. Generally, our preference for sculptural cob is to mix in quite a lot of broken up horse manure fiber, usually redded horse manure, so horse manure that has been washed out by the rain, has not begun to decay yet, but is no longer sticky anymore, and that gets mixed in with a really nice, high quality clay with lots of gritty sand in it. Sculptural details are really fun and tantalizing to do, but one must remember that the wetter the plaster is, the more it will crack when it is smoothed down hard. So it is a good idea to wait for it to set up quite a bit and the inside to dry out quite a bit before you do any details where you smooth down the cob to a gloss. It is a really nice finish, but sometimes it does get surface cracks and you have to go in and paint a little bit more on with paintbrush at the end. Overall, I love how this stove turned out. I think the homeowners were really pleased too, and I hope they have many fine years of service out of it. So to use the oven, once the cob is completely dried out, you will burn a very hot and fast fire in the bread oven, and once the fire has burnt down to basically coals, then all the heat from the fire, or most of the heat from the fire, will be stored in the masonry of the stove, in the brick that it's been burning on, and in the dome of the oven roof. And once it's down to coals, you either pull the coals out entirely, having completely preheated the oven, or for a quicker fire, push the coals just to one side of the oven, and then bake your items directly on the hot stones. By closing the oven door, you will keep in even more heat.
Thanks so much for watching, folks. I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you to everyone who likes and shares our video, everyone who subscribes to our channel, and thanks so much to all of our financial supporters on Patreon, on GoFundMe, and all the ways you show your support. We really, really appreciate you. Until next time.
Yeah.
This is not level.
Do it all the way around.
Oh.
Ba-da-ba. Ba-da-da-da-da.